life, and it's actually I decided to have myself give this talk because I hated what the people did in the first book. So this is a correction of the first book. Now, originally I didn't take into account the possibility that aliens would be intelligent because it seemed to me I was only restricting myself to the solar system, and it seemed like since there was no evidence that there was intelligent life on this planet, that it would be likely we would encounter any on any other planet as well. But I'm going to spread out. Now, these are the good old boy aliens. Fun-loving, a little dangerous, but if you gave them a beer, they'd be okay. And hedonistic, but you might be able to reason with them through utilitarianism. Vulcan-type people, these are very logical, and a problem with them is that they have all kinds of assumptions built into their worldview, and it would probably be very, very difficult to reason with them because there would be so many little nitpicky details to think about. Going even further, a friend of mine, a philosopher named Richard Watson, when this movie came out, said, and now we know that the aliens are totally crazy. And, you know, they play strange music, they cause people to have visions of a mountain in their head, and they kidnap people, keep them for decades, and we'd never be able to figure out these people. And at the end, all they do is they walk out for a moment and raise their hands up and go back in. This guy looks similar, but he's basically a basic scientist. He's a botanist and easy to get along with, doesn't talk much, likes to use phones, works well with children, and probably would make a good babysitter. This type of alien would be a little more problematic. We could work with this alien, but if they had a hunting ethic, this one does, and they decided that they'd like to hunt us, then we would just be prey, and they wouldn't have any ethical relationship with us other than the type that we might have with a deer or a fish. These aliens, this is one of the best really bad aliens. You can't reason with these, no ethical relationship, and self-defense just pops right in. Happen to have sort of a kinship, and there's a DNA link here, and so the one here thinks that Sigourney Weaver is its mother, and Sigourney Weaver in Alien Resurrection could actually lounge back and have a good time with these. Now, we also have long-distance aliens, theoretically, and we're going to do much ethics with them because if they do send us a message, then and we send it back, probably they will have died out by the time they get their message. Or if they do, they'll send it to us, and we won't be here because we will have gone on. There's a funny sort of thing, you know, this is kind of funny, that the message might be, send more I Love Lucy, you know. The most likely aliens, other than the human there, these are Hartman paintings, a few of them. There might be some microbes underneath the sand at some depth, or under this dry creek channel, or on the plains of Mars, that's a photograph, or under the ice of Europa in some vents. These are actually vents on Earth. Or in some hot springs. There's some real strange stuff living in Yellowstone, and there might be something really interesting on Titan. So they might look something like this, or this, or this. Now, to get to the history of environmental ethics, many people think that environmental ethics rose out of the writings of some great thinkers, and they normally come up with these. my specialty has always been sort of the history of ideas behind environmental thought, and I think those people were actually influenced by these matters: landscape painting, which was absolutely essential, landscape photography after 1860, where it became basically an art form, and is a continuation of landscape painting, natural history, science, nature, poetry and prose, landscape gardening, and then finally picturesque travel, which we now call tourism. And all of this, most fundamentally, the link between all of these is really aesthetics. And so even though we talk about ethics, there is an ethical component, but the main thing is aesthetics. And I consider natural history science or environmental science to be aesthetic too, because scientific information actually does give people aesthetic experiences. Although Leopold got things going, he wrote this book, Sand County Almanac, in 1949, but it was reprinted in a Sierra Club Valentine edition in 1970 for the first Earth Day, and that's when people got the idea that philosophy was at the basis of environmental issues. You can see at the end of this particular mean value in a philosophical sense. And there's another one where he says, because we made conservation simple, that's the reason why, or it's trivial, and philosophy and religion have never heard of us. These sorts of issues were extended, I think, in this book, which I was heavily involved in. And there were two papers in the book, one by Holmes Ralston, The Preservation and Natural Value in the Solar System, another one by Baird Callicott. And Ralston developed the following view, that we could respect any natural place spontaneously worthy of a proper name, exotic extremes and natural projects, places of historical value. For example, when the Apollo spacecraft dumped all their cameras on the moon, that's probably going to be a national monument, if not a national park someday. Places of active and potential creativity, and places of aesthetic value, which I consider nearly all of these all of these above would probably fall under that too. Now, I did Ralston a disfavor in the way that I set up what he was supposed to do, because I told him, assume that the solar system doesn't have any life at all, so how would we value it? But Ralston's main philosophical perspective is that the organism is the central feature in environmental ethics. So if I'd let him have extraterrestrial life in there, then he would have given a completely different paper. Then now we have J. Baird Callicott, Moral Considerability in Extraterrestrial Life. This is the paper that I really don't like very much. Callicott was important because he wrote a paper called Animal Liberation: A Triangular Affair, and I want to give you a couple of points about this, which leads up to why he did what he did in the book. He developed three ethics, and he came up with some weird terminology. The first one was ethical humanism, which we can call traditional human ethics. Then he called humane moralism, which I think animal welfare ethics would be more appropriate. And then he said the third was the land ethic, and so they formed a triangle. And he claimed that the land ethic was completely different than the others. So animal welfare ethics is merely an extension of traditional ethics that includes some animals in the moral community but no plants. And the land ethic is a break with traditional ethics, which is holistic rather than or individualistic in its approach. And he also said that pain and pleasure have nothing to do with good and evil. Pain in particular is primarily information, and so pain is good rather than pain is bad. And this was extremely shocking to the animal liberation, animal rights people. They got incredibly upset. They went off, formed their own So in the context of this particular paper, Callicott approaches the issue of ethics with regard to extraterrestrial life. So it's animal welfare ethics versus land or environmental ethics. So it's environmental ethics, but as a land ethic. And so he says extraterrestrial life forms, assuming they are not of earthly origin and inoculated somehow in some foreign body or vice versa, would not be our kin, that is to say, common paleontological parent stock, nor would they be participants in Earth's economy of nature or biotic community. Hence, they would lie outside the scope of Leopold's land ethic. The land ethic could fairly be called a case of Earth chauvinism or terrestrialism, but unlike male chauvinism and racism, the land ethic is not anti-anything. The land ethic simply has nothing to say about extraterrestrial life. And this word terrestrialism was supposed to be terracentrism, to go with anthropocentrism, biocentrism, ecocentrism, but this stupid Sierra Club editor insisted on changing it back to this over and over again, and so it ended up in the book. The life principle reverence for life ethics are, because of their conceptual foundations and logical structures, capable of transference off the earth, but because of their individualistic or atomistic biases, impractical environmental ethics. In other words, the life principle reverence for life ethics are serviceable as extraterrestrial environmental ethics, but ironically fail miserably as terrestrial environmental ethics. So the ethical views that he rejects for this planet, he says, are the only thing we have for other planets. Now, his basic assumptions are that a creature must have DNA from Earth for us to morally be concerned about it. It must be part of an ecosystem originating in the natural systems of Earth. Concern for, and even more basic, was he used to go around and act very smug about this particular issue. Concern for extraterrestrial life conflicts with concern for life on Earth. So if we care about the solar system, it detracts from our concern for this planet. And this is what they used to say in the Middle Ages, that love of nature conflicts with love of God. To love God with all your heart and all your might. So Callicott wanted us to love Earth with all our heart and all our might. So that only Earth should matter, thinking about aliens helps us to see what is important, the Earth, and what is not, the solar system. A few questions about this. So what if Leopold never thought about the solar system when he wrote the land ethic? And I'd say, who cares? I imagine if we could do a seance with Leopold, he'd probably say that we ought to care about things on other planets too. Does only Earth DNA matter? I think as a factual matter that if we found some other kind of DNA, it would matter to us a whole lot. Why can't extraterrestrial ecosystems count? It was kind of like Leopold didn't think, Callicott didn't think we could find any ecosystems, but I think that if we found life, that we would to jury up some theory that there was some kind of ecosystem there. And why can't we care about the Earth and the solar system? Now, William Hartman, who had a paper in the book and was previously published in Environmental Ethics, had this hypothesis that some space advocates will opt for massive exploitation of off-planet resources to reduce the exploitation of Earth resources to a minimum, and that others will reply that such exploitation is just business as usual. We will just be doing to the solar system what we've already done to Earth. And so he envisioned that there would be two different groups that would start fighting with each other once we actually do get off planet. And this would be like the fight between the conservationists and the preservationists, who were actually both environmentalists, but they hate each other. And I think life in the solar system, as on Earth, may play a central role in this debate if we find some. Now, Callicott's solution, once again, is Earth ethics for off-planet, no, which he calls the land ethic, and animal welfare ethics, yes, which he calls the life principle reverence for life ethics, yes. And he takes us back to Albert Schweitzer, reverence for life, but I think a better place to go historically is the 1820s, 30s in Northern Europe and England and North America, where people started protesting about the treatment of horses and dogs and chickens and bears. And suddenly it all took hold. What happened initially was that people tried to pass laws, you know, for better treatment of horses and dogs. And everybody laughed the first few times, and then the laws were passed. And then all of a sudden, we went from having these laws to it becoming sort of an ethical perspective. And it took hold in Northern Europe and North America, but it hasn't done quite so well in some parts of Southern Europe and like Mexico, Spain. In this particular tradition, which is now 200 years old, the basic element is it's morally wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering on animals. So the word is unnecessary suffering. And beyond that, people are still arguing about what the correct philosophical or ethical theory should be to account for that beyond that. But it is associated with utilitarianism, and as you can see, the question is not, this is Jeremy Bentham, can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And Peter Singer picked up on this, and although his book was sometimes confused with being a rights book initially, he made it clear that he was just doing classical utilitarianism. And here's how it works. In the book, he says that people would make the division between animal and vegetable in different places, but for him it would be between the shrimp and the oyster. And the reason is if you stick a shrimp with a pin, it flails around really violently. And if you stick a pin in an oyster, it very lethargically moves. I like to say that the shrimp would go, ouch! And the oyster would go, ouch! He does make one exception. Whoops, went the wrong way. The octopus, which was too far down the chain, and it would have been a vegetable except that it moves too quickly, so therefore it's still an animal. Now, pain and suffering are defensive adaptations of some animals on this planet, and that defensive mechanism may be unique to the biology of this planet, so we might come across life on other planets that actually don't feel pain. And even on this planet, they're not universally accepted as the basis for moral considerability. And now we have the rights position, which pops up all the time, and the reason it pops up is because John Dewey said that we should forget about intrinsic value or valuing things for their own sake, because that was ridiculous in terms of a theory expounded by G.E. Moore, and that's kind of found its way into policy through pragmatism, and so most people are trained not to be able to think in terms of value for their own sake, and they're trained they're only supposed to think of things, valuing things in terms of their use. So, not knowing what else to do, they start talking about rights. Tom Reagan came up with a animal rights view which got you all the way down to mammals. And Reagan says failure to recognize the rights of animals leads to environmental fascism, which is caring more about the system or the species than the individuals that make up the system or species. And such caring is broad, covers lots of things, covers a lot more things than animal liberation or animal rights, but it's thin because it's not interested in the individual for the most part. So their criticism is covers too much, and what it covers too little. Some criticisms of rights, and for most philosophers have rejected the idea of rights in environmental ethics. Callicott says biotic community does not include the right of life. Biotic rights refer to species, not to individuals. Then we get, it's understandable or regrettable that the moral intuition that non-human species have intrinsic as well as instrumental value is properly expressed in terms of rights. species right is understandable because talk of rights has become the usual and preferred way to express moral considerability, but is regrettable because the concept of species rights taken at face value seems to be philosophical nonsense. Then we get that it won't go away because it expresses in a particular current and forceful manner of speech a deeply felt and widely shared intuition that species are intrinsically valuable. Ryan Norton and I were once talking, and I said, they just keep talking about rights. And he said, and they always will because they don't care what they mean. They just want to express their emotions. So Mary Midgley, a British philosopher, says the actual word right cannot, as far as I can see, be salvaged for any clear, unambiguous use in the discussion of moral treatment of animals. Now, in the late Middle Ages, some privileges granted by the king or government became rights that could not be taken away. So we go from a privilege, which is a permission that the king at his whim could say you don't have it anymore because he got mad at you because you said the wrong thing at a party or something, to a right, which is a permission that's permanent and could not be taken away except under extreme circumstances, that you did something morally bad or legally wrong, such as killing someone. Like now we consider that humans have a right to life, but if they kill someone and they live in the state of Texas, then they lose the right to life because of what they did. To make these rights seem stronger, absolute, they were said to be natural from God, pre-societal. Locke said that we came together and formed a social contract, inalienable, that's Jefferson and Declaration of Independence. Now, there's still a big effort to try to make rights work in environmental ethics, and Mary Ann Warren is one of these people, and she says, we don't have to give up on it. A more plausible conclusion is animals do have a right to life, but it's generally somewhat weaker than that of human beings. So weakening their right to life in this way does not render meaningless the assertion that they have such a right, for the point remains that some justification for killing of sentient non-beings is always necessary. They may not be killed merely to provide amusement or minor gains and convenience, but if you want to eat them in the wrong place or something like that, then you may be able to kill them. And it seems to me that we're not giving, if we were to give them these weak rights, that we would be giving them privileges rather than rights. And you can see this in Leopold. A land ethic, of course, cannot prevent the alteration, management, and use of these resources, but it does affirm their right to continued existence, and at least in spots, their continued existence in a natural state. Now, at least in spots is inconsistent with the concept of rights. Because if we applied that to humans, then the Germans could have said, we think that the Jews have rights, and so we're willing to set aside a preservation area called Warsaw, and they can just stay there. And then we're just going to kill all the rest because the rest of them, you know, are in the way. Now there is a big project I discovered this last summer to try to make this move to go from weak rights to strong rights. And the Chinese philosophy community has translated Roderick Nash's book, The Rights of Nature, into Chinese, and has become an incredibly popular book. And they want to try to get everybody talking about rights of nature, rights of animals, and then try to move into rights for humans. And I try to explain to them these are crummy rights, and it's going to be very hard to get to what we mean by rights from these weak rights. But anyway, now if we move to, that's the one tradition which the 1820s, 1830s were concerned about animal suffering. Now there is another one. The concern for the environmental protection originated not in ecology or evolution, which is what Callicott was assuming when he pulled out the land ethic, but in species classification activities. Concern for species protection predates talk about ecology and evolution by more than a half century, about 50 years. Actually, I could go 60, but the guy didn't publish for 10 years. And since it developed long before them, it is not derived from them. The key phrase is wanton destruction. And the idea is that it's morally wrong to destroy members of a species wantonly for no useful purpose. And the idea is that you could kill anything if there's a good reason, but there is some limit, which is you don't want to cause damage to the overall population of the species. Amazingly, I found this book by John Bradbury. He was a British scientist who went up the upper Missouri before Lewis and Clark came down, and he met them as they were coming down. And he was appalled at the tendency of his fur trapper guides to just shoot buffalo from canoes just to see if they could hit them. And so afterwards, when he wrote his book, he denounced them for their wanton destruction and predicted that the buffalo would be totally destroyed by this wanton destruction. And people followed on after this, continuing to do this. And this was a scientific person and who was doing species classification. Now, this particular type of view is not focused primarily on animals. The first national movement to protect a species began in 1857 with a vote by the AAAS, which didn't actually have that name yet. They changed their name, I think, 3 years later. And it was undertaken to protect a plant, not an animal. And this concern was about the extinction of species. They had found dinosaur bones in France in I think the 1790s, and they had also found mammoth bones in Boone's Lake, Kentucky, and it became clear that there had been creatures running around on this earth that weren't around anymore. And so they were worried. It was proof that you could make a species extinct. Species extinction was believed to produce holes in the great chain of being. So you were actually this was kind of a religious matter, and so you were doing something to what God had done. And later, about 50 years later, just a second, when ecology and evolution came along in the 1860s, this should have weakened concern about species because it meant that they could evolve or that it was natural for them to die off and so on. But it all translated easily into this new scientific perspective, and so it worked its way in, and people forgot about the great chain of being. This had nothing to do with pain and suffering. George Catlin, who denounced the fur trappers too in the 1830s for their wanton destruction, himself, just for fun, rode out and killed a buffalo. And what you did was you rode along the side with a sort of a sawed-off rifle, and you got the rifle pointed just behind the buffalo's ear, and then you shot into its brain. And the buffalo didn't die. And he thought, this is a great opportunity to study buffalo suffering. And so he spent an entire day painting pictures of the buffalo dying. And sometimes the buffalo would go, you know, I'll just lie here and not die. And he'd go, get tough, you know. And so the buffalo up again so he could get some fierce visages and so on. And so he didn't care about the suffering, and none of them cared about the suffering of these animals as naturalists, although they might have gone home and worried about somebody mistreating their horse or their dog, but they didn't connect all this up. To see how this works, if we take the examples of the whooping crane and the California condor, when I was a child, I would get the Weekly Reader, and every week it would have a little article about the whooping crane, and I knew through grade school exactly how many whooping cranes there were, and I knew any time an egg hatched and there was another baby whooping crane, and I knew where those whooping cranes were flying and everything. So that when you have a species near extinction, you get information. And the same thing with the California condor. They had biologists rappelling down cliffs and visiting nests, checking out the chicks to make sure they were well and all that sort of thing. And so efforts to protect the species produce behavior that is much the same as recognition of rights for each individual member of the species. And I think the California condor is probably getting better treatment than a lot of humans, maybe in California. I'm not going to be held to that, but it's a guess. However, the object was to increase the population to a point where the death of any individual is of little or no consequence, morally or otherwise, so that if one died, it would just be interesting that it died. So it's not really rights behavior. It just kind of looks like it for a while, and then it drifts away. Now, I hate just about everything that John Passmore ever said, generally, but I do agree that an ethic is not the sort of thing one can simply decide to have. Needing an ethic is not in the least like needing a new coat. A new ethic will arise out of existing attitudes or not at all. And what we actually have, as I presented here, is two traditions. One of them is the unnecessary suffering tradition, which leads to concern about domestic animals. And then we have the wanton destruction which leads to concern about species preservation. And I think that the second one would kick in with extraterrestrial life. So that to revise Callicott a little bit, if so, then an extraterrestrial environmental ethic will most likely not be a reverence for life ethic, which would be in the unnecessary suffering vein. Rather would be a reverence for life forms ethic, which would be like the land ethic, but would not be primarily based on ecology and evolution, but on just our interest in species. And it would not be focused on the individual, but on the classification. So if we find life in the solar system, it will be valued for its scientific interest, its own sake, its intrinsic value, and not because it might feel pain, and not because it might have rights. If we meet dangerous extraterrestrial aliens, self-defense will always be acceptable. If they're exotics, we may be free to exterminate them. If they're in their natural habitat, we may set aside areas for them to live freely. I'm also a caver like Penny, and once at a National Speleological Society meeting, somebody said, how come you think it's okay to kill alien monsters, but you don't think it's okay to kill bats? And I said, well, bats are in their natural habitat, and I think that that if the aliens monsters have a natural habitat, that we could conceivably let them live in the place where they evolved. We also might come to admire them and value them for their own sake, and as Penny pointed out, we also like those cute little babies. We are attuned to it, and so are other animals too, like dogs and cats living in a house frequently, like baby kittens or baby puppies, and frequently a cat or a dog will actually nurse, babies of the other species just because they get into it. And so going back to the bat, it may not be a big step from feeling repugnance for this vampire bat to feeling something more positive. These are cute little baby vampire bats. Whoops, it went the wrong way. Which may be how Sigourney Weaver got to this. And if we go to reality to some degree, if the microbes are dangerous, such as smallpox, we may exterminate them in the wild, but keep a supply of them available in case of a medical emergency. I think we're holding smallpox captive in 20 different locations in closely guarded freezers around the world. We might even decide that they're cute enough to talk about, even something like the Ebola. And you can see the little tag on the Ebola. You can actually, I think, order this on the web in case. That's right. So my conclusion is an extraterrestrial environmental ethic will most likely be a reverence for life forms ethic, similar to a land ethic, more similar than an environmental welfare ethic. The focus will be on the preservation of the species and the system in which the species exists, and not the individual. So that's my talk. I came close.
Not a question. While he's passing the mic around, I'll ask a question. You don't say anything about changing or enhancing or altering that environment. Suppose these organisms are in a natural environment, but they're on the verge of extinction.
Oh. How would we know that?
Suppose we did know it. And he told us. So they're on Mars, and Mars is on its way out.
Well, we're really gung-ho already about trying to prevent species from going extinct. So I think if we ran across and said, boy, we made it to Mars just in time. Now we can start some more species survival plans. So I think that we would, if we encountered some other type of life, that we would really want to have it around.
Question from Dave Morrison. I would think this could be a cleaner discussion if you just discussed microbes, because that is the most likely on Mars or Titan or Europa. And our attitudes, our ethical attitudes toward microbes on Earth are not the same as toward nice furry creatures. And that's really what we're likely to come up against.
Well, see, I think that when you do it from a species perspective, that it's really not all that much different than that we would want those microbes too, I think. That
I agree with that, but I don't see that most of these discussions in the 19th and 20th centuries dealt with microbes.
I know, but at the very end when I was doing the alien monster, and then I went to eventually I went to, after I did the cute stuff, then I went to smallpox and Ebola, and I think that that it would parallel exactly, that we would want it to be alive, but if it was really dangerous to it, we might try to extinguish it, but we want it to be totally gone, and we would keep.
What is the relevance of the history of the last century dealing with dogs and cats and horses?
Well, it's not. I'm saying that the dogs and cats and horses tradition is irrelevant. Okay. I'm saying that the only relevant tradition for extraterrestrial would be the life forms ethic, from the classification people. If you put it this way, if you look at any book that any person ever wrote who went out to study any kind of creature, that the last chapter will be a chapter about how they're in danger and why we should keep them alive. And I haven't ever run across a book that isn't like that. And there's even this book on bats called The Lives of Bats by two bat biologists. And the last chapter is a big appeal talking about that bats are the most scientifically interesting creature on the entire planet, and so we should try to protect them. And so I think a good ground is simply scientific interest, as well as aesthetic. And I think that the scientific interest, as I said already, is also aesthetic. So that I think everything would go in the same way, whether it was a big creature or a microbe. And see, the parallel is that even the big creatures, we're willing to let the individuals die as long as we keep enough of them, and it's somewhat easier, most likely, with the microbes. Okay? Yes?
Hi. I had a good old-fashioned emotional response to one of your slides on the origin of environmental ethics and saying that it started with species classification. I see in this conference that there's, as what often happens in scientific dialogue, that there's a real bias towards Western intellectual sort of dialogue, because probably environmental ethics originated in indigenous cultures, and so we've sort of had a bias here in Western traditions. And so my curiosity is, you know, what can we learn from indigenous or native or traditions which have a reverence for life and actually, you know, said prayers for life before they ate it and had, you know, like, so where is that in your environmental ethics, I guess is my question.
Oh, my concern, let's say if I go back to the beginning, when I was doing my dissertation on Wittgenstein, I was also trying to protect my cave from water pollution. And I found I was saying certain kinds of things, and other people were saying other things back to me, and I wondered, why am I saying these things? And why are they saying those things? You know, and it turns out that we have all this stuff that's in us culturally, and we don't really understand the history of where they came from. And so I actually started doing research on why I said the things I did. I came up with this particular list. And then I figured out why these other people who were opposed to me were saying the things they were saying. And it turned out in their case that they were expressing Germanic land use attitudes that went all the way back to when the Romans first met them in 100 BC, and it had been carried continuously forward. So that my concern has been how do you account for these things that we think of as sort of personal intuitions or social intuitions, and so that's why I'm not focused on indigenous people. However, I did go up to the Yukon once, and I discovered that I'm interested in trying to relate these things like environmental education to environmental law. And so somebody asked me as a keynote speaker to talk about the draft management plan for the Yukon. So I said, show me your environmental law. And it turned out that there were certain values, as in all of our environmental laws, there were certain values to be promoted, and their values were economic, social, aesthetic, and spiritual. And when I got up there and started interacting with the indigenous people, half of the people at the conference were indigenous, I discovered that they actually had different attitudes about all these things, and I realized that you had to take the social, put it over with the spiritual, so it was, cultural and spiritual, so that you had the economic in there, which doesn't ever show up in environmental laws in the United States, and then we had the aesthetic, which basically had to do duty for scientific and other things for the Euro-Canadian perspective, and then you had this other. So I proposed that for environmental education that they teach indigenous stuff under the label of cultural and spiritual value in the schools, and then aesthetic value do scientific and painting and photography and poetry and prose and so on. And so I think if you have indigenous people who are actually making a big difference in a particular society, as they are in the Yukon, that you could have cross-cultural stuff, and they would actually, people could be taught both sets of values, and that there would be a lot of interesting developments there. But I'm not sure that you can do it with in this country, because they're not playing that kind of a role anymore. I hope that helped. Okay, let me say it again.
No, it's great, I'm kidding.
Okay, well, my point is that that I think that I could say, as a philosopher, I could say, boy, we ought to look at the Hopi Indians, and they have a great environmental ethic that we could develop, and we ought to make everybody do environmental ethics, like the Hopis. And I don't think there's a chance in the world that that would happen. In fact, I got into the situation in Korea where I was trying to explain to these Koreans at a Buddhist conference that even though I considered Buddhism to be environmentally superior to Christianity, that Christianity was going to have to take care of the matter in the United States because it was impractical to imagine that we were going to convert everybody to Buddhism in order to make them environmentalists. Yes.
Yeah, my question is, why didn't go further? You like caves, I like water and scuba diving. The Underwater Explorers Society has lots of wonderful writings on how you don't mess with anything. You don't alter anything, ever, unless you absolutely have to gain some important human goal.
Who does?
UNEXO, the Underwater Explorers
Oh.
Society. So let me just move on that. I mean, why, instead of just an ethics for life forms, why wouldn't we have an ethics for nature, an ethics for what is in the natural world? Now, I grant you what is natural is hard to define, and all scientists know that. But why do we stop at life? And that obviously has implications for people who talk about valuing life or maximizing potential for life or foundations for life. So, because I think there is a tradition. I think it's partly in Buddhism, it's partly in indigenous people, partly in our own hearts.
Well, actually, the main reason I stopped where I stopped is because I was talking about valuing extraterrestrial life. But I would also agree, even though I think I shortchanged Ralston in a way, that he did come up with a view which is probably one possibility of what we would do if it turns out that nothing's alive in the solar system. And what he says is actually also reasonably consistent with the kind of history of ideas that I've been tracing out. Yes.
Gene, there's this whole issue of reverence for life in Western civilization, I think, actually has Buddhist roots. I think if you track it back historically, that it post-dates the translations into German of the Bhagavad Gita, the Buddhist sutras, and so on. And then that wave later hit English with everything up to Christopher Isherwood's translation of the Gita. The principle from Buddhism was ahimsa, which is interpreted differently by different groups in Buddhism. You've seen probably pictures of Buddhist monks walking around staring at the ground to be sure that they don't put their foot down on any ant inadvertently. Ahimsa means harmlessness. Some interpret it as meaning doing no harm, and some interpret it as intending no harm. And I think that dichotomy between accidental harm and intentional harm needs to be drawn and should inform our discussion of the applications of the principle of reverence of life in our present setting.
Okay, well, I don't have any objection to that, but my view was that reverence for life wasn't the key element here, and that scientists had actually developed a slightly different thing, which led to slightly different conclusions. However,
I'm not advocating that point of view. I'm saying that this is where a lot of people inherited their baggage.
okay, but it turns out that there is a lot of cross-cultural implications. For example, the really big thing out of Europe, and as I said, I think that environmental ethics is primarily based on aesthetics, on the idea that nature is beautiful, that we actually got this from China, really. That when Marco Polo went there, he saw all of this focus on stuff, and it came back. And initially, you can see this in gardens, that when Europeans make gardens, they initially called them Chinese gardens. And then one day, for some reason, they changed them and started calling them English gardens. And so then they forgot all about the fact that they got all this from China, and so it had become assimilated in.
But the 8th century was the time of the Buddhist invasion of and takeover of the intellectual life of China.
Okay. And all of this is kind of interesting, but it's not going to change the world exactly with regard to someone like my father to change his views about the environment. To give you another type of example here, that my father, I wrote a book called Foundations of Environmental Ethics, and my father refused to read the book because he said that it would be too hard. But he decided that he would ask me one question about it, and he said, just what's your book about anyway? and, and I said, well, Dad, I said, if we had a beautiful landscape and somebody painted a beautiful portrait of it, and all of the aesthetic qualities in the landscape were exactly the same as the aesthetic qualities in the real landscape, which would be more beautiful? And my father said, one of the most ridiculous questions I ever heard in my whole life. And he said, obviously, the real landscape would be more beautiful because it's real. And I said, and my book explains why you think that, Dad. Yes.
One of the things that I just wanted to point out, since the issue of, how much does the thinking trends that we have developed about large organisms that we can see, how much does it matter and overlap with the microbial world? And you said that it's a focus on species. But really, species are not the same thing in the microbial world as they are in the macroscopic world, and to a degree to which we are constantly having our noses rubbed in this fact. So my own conception of species now, after working in exotic environments for 30 years, and with our new molecular tools, where we see sort of a staggering embarrassment of riches in terms of genetic diversity, is that in the microbial world, things are sort of more temporarily packaged as individual organisms. But really what you're looking at is sort of a giant point cloud of genetic information. And so the species concept essentially breaks down utterly at the level of microorganisms, because they don't only descend vertically like we do from parental unit to progeny unit, but they also profligately and promiscuously fling genes around laterally, right? In phages and little cartridges. It's like little cartridge sex, basically, having nothing to do with what we normally think of as sexual sharing. And so the species concept is exceedingly problematical in the microbial world. And of course, we're all struggling with this. How do we even talk about these organisms? How do we talk about them? When we grow them in the laboratory, I say I'm growing a particular strain or a particular species, but in the back of my mind, I know that that's really a very fragile and poor representation of the actual biological reality. So I just wanted to.
And you can try to explain that to the general public when we have the
It's all, and
extraterrestrial.
I can't even explain it to myself, But I mean, it is a very big difference. We think about species.
At the if you pop up to the level of the general public and so on, they would probably just, if you gave it a Latin name, they'd consider it a species, and they'd be happy with that, and they would want to preserve it. Yes.
I was going to ask that same kind of question. I think Penny's point is really good about the problematics of talking in terms of species. I mean, we need to do more work on the ontology of species, if you want, in order to ground the kind of argument that you want to make. But I also want to make a general comment about something that's come up both in comments that you've made and that Penny made about, being, well, this is what these are my arguments, but I don't think we're going to live up to them, and I'm sort of pessimistic about how people really behave, and like you just said now, well, what will function at the level of public action is not going to be, it's good enough for who it's for if you just tell them, if you give them a Latin name. this gets to the distinction that we started out with, that we haven't said too much about, that between ethics and policy. That it seems to me the essence of philosophical ethics is to get good reasons, to get good arguments. And that doesn't necessarily translate in any kind of one-to-one basis into good policies. And that we need to be thinking a little bit about what is the relation between ethics and policy. That we've sort of promiscuously talked about and shuffled forth between ethics and policy, but that deserves a thematic investigation that we haven't undertaken here.
Okay, well, I suppose I'm not particularly pessimistic, because I'm actually saying that there will be a positive reaction towards finding extraterrestrial life. And I'm predicting pretty carefully as it would be and so on. However, part of the reason that I do the things that I've been doing, the things that I do, is there was a paper once, I can't think of the guy's first name, it's Strong, and he has a couple of paragraphs at the beginning, and he says that people go to hearings and they decide they're going to speak on behalf of like a wilderness area or something, and then they start saying, it's kind of like this, I sometimes feel, and all this, and basically they act like they're inventing everything they're saying, and like they made it all up. But actually they're standing at the end of a 4th century tradition, which is developed, and they think that everything they're saying they made up themselves, and then nobody else will be able to understand it. And I think that if people realize that they are part of a tradition and that this stuff comes from somewhere, that on the one hand, that the arguments will then appear to be stronger. So right now you end up with a whole room full of people who understand exactly what the guy's saying, but he's talking like it's all just how he feels, and that we could, and that if we understand why we're saying the things we're saying and so on, and that it's part of a tradition that can actually be articulated in some way, that we're actually getting into in a more
agree.
reasonable way.
That's one possible
And-
explanation for the
And
relation.
if you look back and find out that the reasons that we're saying the things we're saying are really bizarrely strange, then it's easier to say, well, we should really abandon this this type of view. And it looks like I'm 1 minute over.
Not bad, not bad. Okay, so, thanks, Gene. We have a